role did religion play in the conquest of Africa?
Well, it played a key role because it came in with brotherhood. And the African believed in brotherhood. It came in one world idea, one great brotherhood. And of course, this although there were some states that resisted this, saw through it for a long time. And for example, remember the eternal Martyrs. You'd never forget them, because when you can't generalize for the continent, you see, because we're not talking about one nation, we're talking about a continent of people, you see. Have to keep that in mind every minute when you're talking about Africa, that you're talking about a continent. And we generally talk as though we're talking about one nation. We're talking about a continent made up of many nations. Okay, there were those who saw through the trick of religion as it was presented by both Islam and Christianity, and resisted both. The Martyr state was a great example of this. And there were others who resisted for a while, but eventually gave in because trade was a great attraction. Say, okay, you want to let us in? Well, can you let us trade around your borders here? And establish trading posts all around your borders, and gradually, you got in. But surely you let the Christians come in with they just want to preach to you about the same God that you believe in. Just want to show you there's one God over all.
But it was all trickery.
Found this one.
But it was all trickery.
Yes, it turned out to be nothing but trickery. Now, I would not say that this was a grand design of trickery. They just saw there was the traders were shrewd enough to see. The explorers, the conquerors, were shrewd enough to see that if they carried the missionaries in, they wouldn't have to go in fighting. Missionaries in trade as the first bait would make their pathway easier. I would call it, and have called it, the blacks' naivety, the blacks' gullibility, the blacks' over quest for brotherhood. For as I pointed out in a number of places, we were always the brotherhood seekers. We were always the brotherhood seekers. And this has been our main downfall. It is never the reverse. The whites only sought brotherhood or pretended brotherhood, or the Asians only pretended brotherhood. And when they saw an advantage of economic and political rule as the ultimate outcome.
Why is it that you always hear about European invasion of Africa, but very little about the Asian and the other groups that you mentioned?
Because the Europeans were the last. Colonialism is uppermost in our mind. Colonialism has just been, that is, political colonialism, I put it that way, has just been destroyed. Economic colonialism still persists in Africa. So the European hold on Africa was politically broken when they began to become free and set up their own government. However, as I also point out in my writing, that Africa is only half free, and I would hardly call it half free, when it's only politically free. It will not be free until it's economically free. So long as the economy is still under the control of foreigners, then its government is under the control of foreigners. It was unfortunate that blacks in the United States are still, like their African brothers, absorbed with the idea that politics is their salvation. Politics is not the salvation of the blacks. Politics is only one aspect. Without the other, you're nothing, and that is economic power. Economic power controls the politician. The politician acts and is controlled by the economic power of this nation. of any nation. That's where the power lies.
Breakdown Friday, Joseph Ward, Professor Carl Tone Jones, Patrick Irvin. We are back. How y'all doing? Hope y'all enjoying yourselves. Shout out to the builders of tomorrow. Getting into a breakdown of Chancellor Williams. Gave us a lot of information, but I'm centering this conversation around why haven't we learned from history? Up to this point in 2023, where we are in 2023, and with the understanding that everybody doesn't have the same education or wasn't exposed to a good amount of history. So talking to those who know the history, those who have been exposed to it, those who've taught it, those who've learned it, why haven't we learned from history? And overall, why do we have an issue letting go of our European attachments, understanding that we are under the system of white supremacy, but still we have European attachments that we just cannot let go of? So why can't we let go of our European attachments, and why haven't we learned from history? I want to start with you, Pat. Let's start with you. Why do you think, going off, listening to the information that Chancellor Williams has talked about in this clip? I know all three of us, and for those of you who are watching, if you aren't familiar with Chancellor Williams' book, Destruction of Black Civilization, you have to get your hands on it, you have to read it. But being familiar with his work and the information that he gave in the clip, you know, his book was basically was telling us, hey, this is what happened, and this is what happens when you don't learn from history. But why do you think we still haven't learned those lessons and been able to implement what we've learned, Pat?
I think it's because we haven't really studied it or learned how to apply it. You know what I'm saying? Like when we go through the breakdown of what history is, even when he talks about politics, right? And he says, politics is not the answer. Politics is a tool. A lot of us don't understand what he means by that. And that's because we haven't really bothered to look up what, each one of the words in that phrase, in that sentence means. You start talking to people about what politics is, I don't really have an answer. They or the picture they paint is a picture that is so limited in scope. Politics is a necessary evil, but it is not the tool. When I'm teaching kids, I tell them politics is a tool used to solidify your gains. You've achieved a certain level, you've achieved a certain status, you've made certain things happen, and now you solidify that by making that law, or making it policy, or making it something that is legally or governmentally or group enforceable. This type of behavior, that is politics, the management of power. So, but then we get into, okay, well, if politics is the management of power, then it can't be how you accrue it, because you have to accrue power in order to engage in politics.
Right.
So how do you accrue power? And that's when he goes into economics. So people have all these, we don't talk, people think economics is only business. No, economics is the management of resources.
Right.
The management of resources. How do you manage your resources? But then that asks another question. Okay, so if economics is the tool used to gain power, and power is the management of politics is the management of power, and economics is the tool used to engage in politics, but economics is the management of resources. Well, then how the hell do we gain like, you see how you can go down all these different levels, and people just don't do that.
Right.
They take these superficial, shallow versions, definitions, very limited of the words, and then they try to formulate some grand plan or some grand theory, and that's just not how it works. The other problem we have is they're taking the words of the ancestors and the elders, the master teachers from decades ago, and trying to apply them literally today. Chancellor Williams said that European colonism is foremost in our mind because it's the last thing that happened. Well, there's a Chinese colonization happening right now. So you can't say that the European colonization is the last thing that happened in 2023 because
Right.
that's not accurate anymore. But that's a small jump to make. But how many people are actually making that jump? Or when they do make that jump, they immediately try to refute everything else he's saying by saying, see, he ain't even accurate. What about what's going on right now? Totally missing the fact that you're living 30, 40 years after he said
Right.
this thing he
Right.
just said.
Right.
So
Right.
it's a real complicated it's a real complicated, it's not a complicated answer to your question,
Right.
but it's a complicated issue that we're dealing with as to why why we're stuck.
Well, one of the things you mentioned right there, Chinese colonization. Chinese colonization is only possible if we haven't learned from the last group of people that colonized us. And we're still reeling from what happened from the last group of people that colonized us. Europe still controls the politics and the economy of the majority of the nations across the world that have black people living in them or even run by black people. Europeans have their hands in their economics and in their politics. So that is one thing that leaves us vulnerable. The Chinese, being a competitor of the Europeans and the Africans, saw a chance to be able to go in and open up and colonize. But on the African continent, colonization isn't possible if people aren't cooperating with the Chinese. That brotherhood that he was talking about. So we ain't learned, especially if we gonna see it, because we know Chinese colonization is happening right now. So in that light, we have not learned. Yeah. So same thing to you, PC. What give your ideas on, why haven't we learned from history?
I think we have learned from history. And one of the things we learned from history is ass whoopings matter.
I was waiting on it. I was
No,
like,
as soon
where
as
he
he
going with
said
this?
that, I was like, all right, I know where he going.
It's a setup. Yeah, it's a setup. Yeah. They do. They do.
Listen, man. We know that these Europeans got savage with it. There's also a history of Asians being savage with it. You see when the beverage, occurred. I don't want to, I know how they do the thing. When the beverage occurred in 2020, we saw Asians whooping African ass all throughout China, Japan, wherever they were. Been kicking them on the streets, and African nations basically did very little to go get their people. We can relate to that. Some of us can relate to that. I'm not trying to start no trouble. But the bottom line is what Patrick said earlier. You need power to do any of this stuff. And we keep trying to find shortcuts to power. So we have pseudo-intellectuals who want to gaslight the next generation of fighters because they ain't got the courage. I can recall a Facebook post of mine several years ago where a brother said he's learning and he's teaching his son to fight the battles tomorrow that he ain't fighting today. And I said, Negro, did you read what you wrote?
Right. How the hell you gonna teach him how to do something you're not doing?
And don't seem to have the courage to do. So that's one of the biggest issues that I see facing us right now. We don't want the smoke. We are very comfortable being colonized. Not even just in Africa, here in America. Anywhere you see black people in the Caribbean, where there's the Asian invasion took place in the Caribbean long before it took place in Africa. And you look anywhere in the world, black people are, somebody else is in charge, even if it's a black face sitting at the head of the table.
Exactly.
And so we learned from it. And then you've had people who benefit. You have the small segment of society that benefits from the colonization, be it African dignitaries and leaders, be it your local crony politicians, way down to your civil your town councils and city councilmen, council people. They benefit. Pockets get stuffed to consistently, put glass ceilings up, thwart progress, promote propaganda against progress, lie to the faces of people, telling them progress has been made. I mean, I can't tell you how many people will argue that black people in such great positions after the Obama administration, when I live in North Philadelphia, and I can see what didn't happen. So, we're looking to be intellectual, and and I mentioned it, but Patrick uses a word that I think is brilliantly used. Oh, I don't have tongue ties tonight. Brilliantly used. I got it out, y'all. Epigenetic memory.
Yeah.
We remember how savage the reign of terror was here in America, the bloody summers of 1919, the whole consummation of the Jim Crow era. We remember that, the fear of being in the house before sundown. We remember all of those things, and it's passed down generation to generation. That's why the safest person in a black neighborhood is a little white girl who lost looking for mommy and daddy. Because ain't nobody going to touch that girl, and everybody's going to make sure she finds her way home safely, because we don't want to incur the wrath of the white community, white power structure, if something happens to that little girl. And I'm not saying it to say we should be hurting little children, but I'm just putting things in perspective. The perspective is we've learned from that history in terms of what we should do. You'll have debates with people about what we should do. But last I checked, during the Haitian Revolution, those Africans wasn't doing no debates. Last I checked, when Denmark Vesey was gathering his folk, there wasn't no debating going on about what should be done and how it should be done to motivate anybody. All right. When all the different uprisings happened on those plantations, it wasn't no debate. Nobody had to debate with Harriet Tubman about what must be done. Nobody had to debate with Frederick, well, even though Frederick Douglass was a debater, when it came to getting his own freedom, his hands did the talking. All right. He beat his freedom out of that overseer in that barn that day. All right. And made his way to freedom. He did all the oratory stuff later. See, we want to do all the oratory stuff, and you can tell in the communities we live in right now, people don't even want to use their hands. That's why we all these out here in the streets. We have to bleep that out. But that's why we all these cats out here getting dropped with arsenals and things of that nature, because cats ain't got the heart to use their hands. Well, who raised them? Who taught them? So
our generation,
right? And the one in my generation before yours. So we have laid down the 60s and the 70s, and I've spoken to elders. The fight was beaten out of black people who actually were pushing for black liberation. The fight was beaten out of them, and they were isolated on islands of their own. The majority of the community watched them, and the children watched them. So when the children grew up, the children said, I'd rather gang bang on each other, because going after independence for black people will have you a political prisoner, will have state-sanctioned hits on you by local law enforcement, and the way they wage war, they kick ass and ask questions later. And that's what, so yeah, we learned the lesson. And the lesson was, we don't want that smoke.